Hi, everyone. I'm Brad Free with David Aragona. This is Derby Watch, and we're going to talk about some of the changes to the Derby Watch list in the wake of the Florida Derby and Arkansas Derby run last weekend. David, we still have the same 3-year-old colt at the top of the list, but maybe Forte has shown a little bit of vulnerability, and there's also a couple changes to the Derby Watch top 20.
Yeah, first of all, a couple adds and drops this week. We did lose Disarm and Red Route 1, both runners from the Steve Asmussen barn. Disarm kind of on the bubble with points, just got pushed out to make room for some horses that ran last weekend, and Red Route 1 seems to be a little points deficient at this point, so he is off the list. And Mage and Cyclone Mischief, who were second and third in that Florida Derby, do take up spots on the list at 15 and 30 to 1 respectively. But as far as Forte goes, Brad, I did increase his price a little bit. He was 3 to 1 last week going into the Florida Derby. I raised him to 7 to 2 this week, just trying to take a conservative approach because the race did not come back that fast. He had to work harder for the victory, and I think a lot of people expected. And we still have an entire weekend of preps coming up, 3 major Kentucky Derby preps. So I want to wait and see how those races shake out before I solidify Forte's status as some kind of short-priced favorite.
He went from 3 to 1 to 7 to 2, but the colt who made the biggest move on Derby Watch, he was listed at 30 to 1 a week ago, Angel of Empire. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about his Arkansas Derby in a few minutes, but he was decisive in victory, and you dropped his odds all the way down to the second choice at 8 to 1. Talk briefly about the price adjustment on Angel of Empire.
Yeah, a horse that maybe we were underrating a little bit, pegging him at 30 to 1, because he did win that Risen Star fair and square, and became apparent in that Arkansas Derby that he is just a horse that has been improving with every race this year, took another big step forward to win that race pretty decisively. So I currently have him as the second choice on this early line, but I expect a lot of things to change next weekend.
Well, for sure. Practical Move runs Saturday in the Santa Anita Derby, and he'll be one of the subjects of the previous segment of Derby Watch. A couple of other relatively minor odds changes. David, you bumped Reincarnate from 15 to 1 to 30 to 1 in the wake of his, in my opinion, disappointing third place finish in the Arkansas Derby. He reportedly is still headed to the Kentucky Derby. And Rocket Can, I'd have to call his status on the list dubious at this point. They're not ruling the Kentucky Derby out, but trainer Bill Mott told DRF reporter Mary Rampolini that he wants to see how Rocket Can trains over the Churchill Downs track in the next few weeks before they make a final determination whether or not Rocket Can starts in the Kentucky Derby. So his price went all the way up to 50 to 1. Okay, let's talk about the 2 biggest races last weekend. And the first one is the Florida Derby, and it featured 2-year-old champion Forte, who, going into the race, I thought he laid all over the field. And Forte did win the race, David, but perhaps a little less decisive than many of us expected.
Yeah, he went off at, I believe, 1 to 5 or 3 to 10. He was expected to win this race pretty decisively, and he didn't quite do that. And it seems like people had almost predetermined that Forte was going to get a bad trip from post 11 in this Florida Derby. And I actually thought that Irad Ortiz gave him a fantastic ride. He was never as wide around the turns as he could have been. I thought Irad made some key decisions during the race that allowed him to get over into the 3 path, whereas he could have been stuck out in the 5 path like some other horses were. So all things considered, I thought Forte got a pretty good ride and still had to work pretty hard to beat the quickly improving Mage.
Let's take a look at the stretch run of Forte, and that's him on the far outside, and he's grinding and grinding. The most impressive part of the race for Forte was in deep stretch, in the shadow of the wire, when he just accelerated and ran past Mage. A good, solid win by a very good colt. He earned a 95 Beyer speed figure. He won by a length at odds of 3 to 10. And the way he finished this 1 1/8 race, wow, I don't believe that a 1.25 miles is going to be an issue for this good son of violence. He's still undefeated around 2 turns, but as well as Forte ran, and I think he did run well. I don't think there's any knock on his performance. I think we also have to recognize that the 2nd and 3rd place finishers in the Florida Derby also ran well. 3rd place finisher, Cyclone Mischief, he lost a lot of ground. He ran third. He was probably third best in the race. But the runner-up, Mage, I thought that he was outstanding in his performance. He broke slowly again. He's got gait issues. That's the second consecutive race in which Mage broke slowly from the gate. This is a horse who won his debut sprint on the front end. So he has some gait issues to overcome. But David, you and I agree that what Mage did on the far turn of the Florida Derby was super impressive. And we're going to go back and take a look from the half-mile pole to the wire and go ahead and describe what you're seeing from Forte in sixth right now and watch this horse that's going to blitz right past him. Talk about the Florida Derby from here.
Yeah, Forte is that horse highlighted there with the blue silks and orange cap, and you're going to see Mage come into the screen just behind him. This was in the midst of Mage's far turn blitz, where he literally went from last to first. He was last moving down the backstretch after that poor start and passes every runner in this field to basically lead by the time they turn into the stretch. And you could see Irad Ortiz, arguably Forte just didn't have the momentum to go with Mage at that point in the race, but Irad also paused for a second and kept this horse inside around the turn, whereas Mage went outside of him to make that run. And you could see Irad was able to save that ground by only tipping outside of Mage once they got to the straightaway. And at this point in the race, you could see Mage sort of pays the price for making that very early move, commencing at the half-mile pole, and Forte is able to wear him down at the end. But Brad, I do want to make the point, this race did feature a pretty fast pace. So it was just kind of coming apart in a general sense at the very end. And often in races like that, you're best off making the last move, which is what Forte did. And Forte did get a 95 buyer for this race. The revised time, the figure was lowered a little bit. And that's a step backwards from the number that he got in the Fountain of Youth. And I know very early in Derby Watch season, we showed that graphic of the record of Breeders' Cup Juvenile winners coming back in the Kentucky Derby. And it would be rare that a horse actually improves after being so precocious during its 2-year-old season. And I think that question is still hanging out there. Is Forte getting better, or is he just the same horse that he was last year?
And maybe all he does is maybe all he is required is to stay the same as he was last year. So far, we've seen some good performances by 3-year-olds that are just about on par with Forte. But I mean, I think a lot of us expected him to just go out there and take care of business in the Florida Derby. I think that race showed that he is not the dominating force that he once was. And I believe, and I think you might concur, David, that Mage ran every bit as well as Forte. Having said that, if I had to make a Derby selection today, I think I would have Forte ranked above Mage. Forte has a body of work. He has a 2-year-old campaign. He's dead fit. He's unbeaten around 2 turns. He doesn't have the gait issues of Mage. Where would you, if you had to make a choice today, would you still have Forte above Mage as far as preference in order of most likely winner of the Derby?
I probably would, because I share those concerns about Mage's gait troubles and him working out the right kind of trip in the Derby, whereas you can have more confidence that Forte has the seasoning to work out the right kind of trip. I question whether I want anybody out of this Florida Derby, and I suspect there might be some stronger preps run leading into that first Saturday in May.
For sure. There was one horse on Derby Watch going into the Florida Derby. There are 3 coming out. So Forte, his odds ticked up from 3-1 to 7-2. And Mage is back on the list at 15-1. And we also added Cyclone Mischief to the list, to the Derby Watch top 20. Okay, let's talk about the Arkansas Derby run last weekend at Oaklawn Park. And this is a race that I think it's just as much the stories of the race are who showed up and who did not. And there was one very impressive winner who did show up. Talk a little bit about the Arkansas Derby.
Yeah, when I was handicapping this Arkansas Derby, I ended up upgrading Angel of Empire a lot, more so than I thought I would like him in the race, just because going back to watch his races coming in here, it just seemed like he's a horse that really was improving at the right time, and he certainly took that big step forward in the Arkansas Derby, and we can take a look at the stretch run of that race. And Flavian Pratt commenced what looked like was an early move around the far turn to rush past the leaders, but this horse was able to sustain it through the final quarter mile here, pulling away from this field. A lot of rivals were expect to, give him a challenge. Looked like an evenly matched field on paper, and Angel of Empire just ran away from them late. So a big step forward from him. And Brad, he certainly feels like one that is going to relish the 10 furlong distance next month.
Well, not only does he finish like a horse that's going to relish that distance, but every single dirt race that he has run has been better than the race before. And I don't know, I was not that taken by his win in the Risen Star. I have since changed my mind. I think you kind of have to when a horse wins off by 4. Very impressive win, and I think he made the right move, knocking his odds down to 8-1 co-second choice. That's Angel of Empire. I guess the disappointments in the race include Reincarnate, who had a tough trip in the Rebel Stakes. We expected him to kind of run back to his previous form. He didn't. He pressed the pace, and he was under a drive into the lane. I'm not sure how he held third. It's a good thing he did, because I guess they're still pointing toward the Kentucky Derby with Reincarnate. But that was a step backward. And Rocket Can, another horse who completely misfired. Bill Mott told Mary Rampolini this week that the Kentucky Derby is still under consideration for Rocket Can, depending on how he trains at Churchill Downs. But coming out of the Arkansas Derby, David, I think there's really only one serious horse to follow. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be disappointed with those horses that you just mentioned, because they were beaten by a horse that I think was upwards of 50-1 in the race, King Russell, who was coming off some much slower speed figures in a maiden victory. So just a much less accomplished horse was able to finish ahead of them. So you didn't get that step forward that a lot of people were looking for from Reincarnate or Rocket Can. So I would say their status as Derby contenders is very much in doubt.
Reincarnate was coming out of the Rebel Stakes. So was Red Route 1 and Red Route Run. He did not run very well. He's off the list. He only has 33 points. Might not be enough to make the cut. I'm wondering, David, in hindsight, maybe the Rebel Stakes was not a real good race. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next segment, the preview segment, because Verifying, who finished 4th in the Rebel with a tough trip, he's one of the contenders this weekend in a major prep race. We'll talk more about the Rebel Stakes, but it's looking like that was not such a key race. If anything, it might be a negative key race. That's it for the recap segment. The final major prep races are this weekend in California, Kentucky, and New York. David and I will discuss those in the next segment of Derby Watch. That's the preview segment coming up next.